The cursed land lies deep in a dense, colorless forest. Hidden within this land is an ancient city, once known to the forest folk as the Holy Land. Buried in the depths of the city, a warning was discovered long after the rulers have fallen. Grave misfortune will befall those who behold the idol that stares into the darkness. The idol, taken from the ancient land, led the kingdom down a path of destruction. The idol must be returned. Under a dark and cloudy sky, the Swordmaster led his men to the ancient land. The cursed land swallowed the soldiers, and all that remained was dark silence.
King's Field 4 is an action RPG designed by From Software and released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2. It's the final entry in the prototypical Souls series that began on the original PlayStation back in 1994. This would be the final game in the series in an agonizingly long 8 years before the series style would be reinvented in Demon's Souls in 2009. The King's Field series is a throwback to an older style of an RPG before Soulsborne was even a thing. The series most closely resembles an odd hybrid of primitive Metroidvania and a limited 3D version of the Legend of Zelda series, even though the series came out before Ocarina of Time, mixed with an odd first-person dungeon crawler blobber camera that kinda makes me think of the early Wizardry or Might and Magic games. Admittedly, the series does have quite a bit of that older video game jank to it, and most players nowadays would prefer games blessedly free of such antiquated jankiness.
Oh, but Mo, the jank! The jank!
Not me, though. I actually appreciate the inelegance of these older games. My fondness for them may derive, admittedly, from a sense of nostalgia at the quaintness of the controls and the sort of frustrating design choices here and there. But let me be clear that the King's Field games are remarkable not just for nostalgia or to gaze at an ancient prototype of what would become the Souls games. They're an excellent game series in their own account, jank and all. So let's put aside our general disdain for the obvious clunkiness of the era of action gaming for just a moment so we can appreciate one of the best underrated RPGs on the PS2. King's Field 4 begins with the fall of the small mountain kingdom of Helidon. The king of Helidon was visited by a mysterious cloaked figure and presented with a magical idol. The statue is said to represent the highest virtues of peace, and it was placed with great reverence in the king's throne room. As soon as this poisoned chalice was accepted by the king, Helidon began its spiral into darkness. Plague decimated the population, despair reigned amongst the once cheerful people. A great billowing cloud of charcoal-gray fog obscured the sun and withered the land. Much like Artorias and Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder, the king of Helidon and the great Swordmaster set out to cleanse the world of evil by invading its source, the dark land of disaster. But their crusade fails, and the cursed statuette has fallen into your hands. It's up to us to reach the eponymous ancient city, a Moria-like subterranean metropolis built on top of the source of evil, and destroy the curse once and for all. Video games must, as all entertainment does, share similarities and influences with other forms of media, but too often those respected older forms of entertainment exert an overpowering influence on video games. They contaminate standards and make it difficult for a new art form to fully develop its own unique style. King's Field 4 is one of the best examples of the uniquely gaming-related storytelling that puts the player in full control of the experience. Learning about the story of King's Field 4 is very difficult, even obtuse. The manual provides a brief glimpse at the plot of the series. The Land of Disaster was once called the Holy Land, and inhabited by an ancient race of so-called forest dwellers. In other words, elves. The elves may have been the first to draw the wrath of the abyssal darkness now cursing mankind. Another race of dwarf-like people, called the Earth Folk, live in the caves surrounding the ancient city. An obscure hint at one point mentions the Earth Folk and the Forest Folk joining together so they can restore light to the world. So maybe your goal is to create peace between the lost races of Earth and Forest.
Peace, y'all! Peace between dwarves and elves!
An easy-to-miss source of information is graffiti scrawled on the walls. You may play the game for a long time without even realizing that you can click on the blurry, low-res writing that looks like background graphics. Even then, the writing is mysterious and difficult to decipher. We are clearly missing vital information about the fall of the kingdom that prevents us from truly understanding everything. Looked at through the lens of traditional fiction, movies, or playwriting, this is somewhat poorly constructed and incomprehensible. But games work best when they do not tell a by-the-numbers narrative you would find in other media. Digging through the remains of a ruined culture, with only a few scraps of writing, artifacts, and architecture is a form of storytelling that video games excel at. Instead of narrative fiction, it's the storytelling of history. The game is not so ego-focused that it's your story or about the player's glorious character and actions. It's about the uncovering of a mystery. Your character is the prince of the neighboring kingdom of Azalin, but it's so irrelevant to the plot it's barely worth mentioning. The story is about the quest, not the man who undertakes it. How did this nation fall to ruin? What lives were led by its heroes, and how did their heroes fail? What is the ruinous darkness from deep beneath the earth, and can it ever really be destroyed? You won't really answer these questions with any real satisfaction, even by the end of the game. It's all left up to your own interpretation. The best part of these games, and in many ways a lot of older games in general, is that they just provide the tools to think. They admit fully that no ultimate meaning is going to arrive. It's literally impossible to grasp everything about the Land of Disaster because the shattering failure to survive the desolation of the Abyss, dragging everyone, even heroes, down with them, ruined so much of what came before. The characters are mostly dead or bitterly depressed. The tiny fragments of dialogue gleaned from them create a mood of misery and hint at something bigger. But the player has to be a part of that. Everything is just a catalyst to the imagination. A design style that was maybe a bit too ahead of its time. Only in the early 2010s would the internet provide the perfect canvas for players to share their theories about what's going on and create a community narrative based on everyone's subjective interpretations. Repeated references are made in the game to a mysterious heroic swordsman. He was the man in the opening cutscene leading the great men deep under the earth to end the curse, shadowing the land. We meet a few of his bedraggled and demoralized soldiers barely clinging to life in the dungeons. Only near the very end of the game do we find someone who may be the great hero, chained in a dungeon, reduced to a skeleton long ago. Only his magic sword remains, more than a little like Conan discovering Crom and his magic sword buried in a stone tomb. It's up to you to finish his quest and restore light before the darkness overtakes the kingdom of Helidon and maybe the whole world. Fans of Dark Souls will instantly recognize the bare bones of Kingsfield 4's plot. A bitter struggle between elemental forces of the universe understood by humans as light and dark. Inevitably, the moral frailty of humanity causes evil to blossom and swallow a land in darkness, and it's up to the player to discover what happened and finally erase the curse of darkness in the world once and for all. Late in Kingsfield 4, you finally reach a bottomless pit of villainy, the Abyss, draining and ruining the world through entropy and rot. Much like the blind emptiness of the Abyss at the bottom of Ulasil in Dark Souls 1. It cuts to the very heart of what all fantasy fiction really is, a profound sense of wonderment and confusion when clashing headlong with the backwardness and desolation at the heart of the medieval world, compared to the glorious ruins of the classical age. It's part of why modern fantasy fiction even exists, a depressing recognition of the entropy that turned a past golden age into the current dark age. Kingsfield 4 follows a kind of Dantean journey downward into hell. In the chthonic depths of the lost city, the farther you go down, the more primitive the world becomes, until it's eventually submerged in the atavistic, primordial water from which all life and existence flows. Wild animals and the skeletal remains of people are replaced by elemental creatures and eventually demonic entities. In the lowest realm, the poisonous source of evil lay nameless horrors that spawn from the walls and ceilings. The entire area is utterly alien, and those walls resemble the wrinkled gray matter of the brain. Maybe all the evil in the world is just born from the depths of the human mind. The game's tone and atmosphere are uniformly gloomy and tragic. The first sight in the land of disaster is the swaying clouds of tenebrous mist cloaking the sky in gray. Like most of the later Souls games, you get the feeling you are an interloper in a land that has already fallen to tragedy. Heroic action and whimsical fantasy are eschewed in favor of hopelessness and misery. Among the first few NPCs you meet are a man staring at an uncrossable chasm. His wife and children are on the other side, and he has no way of seeing them ever again. Well, it's the first thing you run into after you inevitably die to this instant death trap, which is located literally 5 seconds after you start the game. Kingsfield 4 was made by From Software, remember. Next we find a young girl. Her father died while adventuring, and her mother is slowly dying of poison. Even when you find an item to cure her, she doesn't thank you. She wonders aloud why you would ever help a complete stranger, as if the idea of charity and kindness have long since vanished from the kingdom. Kingsfield 4's story is not about a complicated web of social connections or politics or philosophy. It's about dissecting an entire nation, about why their suffering and despair exist.
No one, not even you, will remember if we were good men or bad, why we fought, or why we died. No.
We aren't able to learn everything, but the game does present us with an excellent mystery. One of the most atmospheric parts of the game is an inexplicably pitch-dark room deep inside the royal palace. After fighting your way past the stone myrmidons guarding the chamber, a simple fire spell will light up the room and... The music is especially good here. The soundtrack is by Tsukasa Saito, who also worked on the soundtrack for Bloodborne. It's an odd mixture of synthesized eeriness, orchestral score, and almost primitive video game electronics. At its best, the soundtrack creates a kind of oppressive fog of the bizarre and grim. Sometimes it can be a bit banal and maybe overbearing when empty silence would be preferred, but generally it creates a feeling of dread in the mostly empty shells of former castles, caves, and temples. Kingsfield 4 is the epitome of a game showing and not telling. What is this evil, eerie-looking room doing directly beneath the king's throne room? What are these statues? Why are they hanging so bizarrely upside down? What is this here for? That's the best way to enjoy this game. Exult in the mystery, speculate on the weirdness, and love not knowing everything.
Mysteries, we love mysteries. Life is filled with them. And some of them are very abstract.
Kingsfield 4 has some of the best level design that From Software has ever made. Both the aesthetics of the levels and the structure of the maps themselves are pitch perfect, and vary considerably in style from area to area. Our quest begins above ground in the murky gloom, overtaken by wild bugs and man-eating vegetation. Nature is the only thing remaining on the surface. A few animals, slimes, and plants are left in the Holy Land after the Cataclysm. But after only a brief time in the light, we go on a relentless trip downward from the surface into the ruins of a once great civilization. Kingsfield 3 changed the dungeon element of the game by creating a mostly exterior open world. Kingsfield 4 gives you a quick glimpse of the surface before shuddering you in the underworld for most of the game. returning to the roots of the series but considerably expanding it to a level never seen before in a dungeon crawler. The dungeon crawler is where the video game RPG genre began in the late 70s, and Kingsfield 4 is one of the ultimate expressions of that oldest of gameplay styles. The ancient city itself is an incredible-looking structure with a huge central tower surrounded by multiple levels. Each area is linked by a stone bridge controlled by a special mechanism you have to discover while exploring. The interior of the city feels like a true habitation with homes, public squares, workshops, and everything you need for a thriving metropolis. Each level of the city is divided into 4 cardinal sections, but beyond those sections are further areas carved out of the rock itself, where more strange or evil creatures dwell, though you certainly won't be staring at grey bricks or brownish cave walls for 30 hours. There are so many unique-looking areas to the ancient city, it's hard to list them all. You have subterranean tombs and cemeteries, of course. A brightly lit sylvan realm for the forest folk. Forges churning with lava and guarded by flying red dragons. Underwater caves home to aggressive plesiosaurs. A temple to the Serpent Empress that is guarded by jets of flame. A series of mine carts you can ride back and forth. A gigantic shrine or temple surrounded by deep water. Perhaps my favorite area is the home of these maybe ice giants on a lonely stretch of land across a windswept bridge. As dark as the game is, there are also moments of great beauty in the world as well. Next to the throne room is an unexpected burst of life inside a magical forest, surrounded by golems and water. Relentless doom and gloom would be unmanageable without contrasting brilliance, and you'll be surprised to be crawling through a dank crypt for hours, then stumble upon a sight of startling beauty. The levels themselves are also maze-like and confusing to traverse. Confusing in a good way, though. Like you have to actually think to figure out where to go next, unlike the pathetic straight line to the exit in Skyrim, but without tearing your hair out obfuscation like in Daggerfall. One unfortunate issue that the game possesses is with the backtracking. Like any good Metroidvania-style game, you must return to previous areas with new keys or items, but the hugeness of the game world coupled with your glacial movement speed makes long stretches of the game dull excursions back to familiar merchants or healing fountains far back at the beginning. Most irritating is that chests are located throughout the game that you discover but are unable to open until you find a key for that chest much later in the game, and it is very easy to simply forget where these chests are, because it may be hours and hours and hours until you find the requisite key, and you have no idea where you have to go back, unless you keep meticulous track of where all these chests are, and frankly even that would be difficult because you'd have to write not only where it is, but exactly how to get to it from the hub area. It's way too confusing. Fortunately, most of those chests, aside from one or two special areas, are just sort of side items you don't really need, but it's still a major issue that you're simply not going to remember, and you have no way of marking on any kind of map where exactly these chests are, so you simply can't find them. Shortcuts are unlocked here and there by opening locked gates and so forth, but it's not enough to really speed progress. You do get access to a teleportation system to leap from one area to the next, but it limits the teleport locations to 4 areas for most of the game. Crucially, you may not warp from any point, but only from designated areas to a designated area, of which there are precious few. I understand that this is to prevent people from misusing the teleport as a get away from any danger at any time button, especially later in the game when you will need to frequently restock on mana, health, and other items. It becomes a real irritation. Figuring out where to go and how to unlock new areas was mostly intuitive. I only had one moment at about the middle of the game where I truly got lost and just wandered back to the beginning aimlessly. Fortunately, I wandered back to the very start of the game and stumbled across an item I'd never received, because I couldn't get into that area until I had much higher health, and would have ignored a very valuable piece of magic if I hadn't become confused and backtracked without a real goal. The game does not feature any kind of auto-map, forcing the player to simply memorize the area they are in. There are technically several maps to be found, and I use that word as disdainfully as I can because they are laughably inadequate. They resemble real-life primitive etchings in stone or painting on deerskin. The only map with any real navigable value is found at almost the very end of the game. It works perfectly for guiding you through the very last stage and final boss battle at least. It would have been nice if you got this at the very beginning of the game. Secret walls can be found throughout almost every level, and they're a little bit of a problem. As exciting as it is to find a secret wall and get a unique item, it doesn't make for enthralling gameplay to stare at a wall everywhere you go, hammering the X button, checking for secrets. Even if it seems like no secret wall could be there, some of the walls have tiny alcoves that open up, revealing an item, so if you want everything, you'll have to check basically everywhere. About 2/3 of the way through the game, you can find an item that lights up all secret doors, which makes everything so much easier. Thankfully, I don't think there are any areas that require hidden walls, or at least very few, so you could technically ignore it, but finding secrets is part of the fun. Only at the very end of the game, when I was backtracking through an old area, I noticed that there was a hidden floor panel leading to a treasure chest. I'd never even considered that this might be anywhere else in the game, and maybe it isn't, but I may have missed large numbers of secrets just because I had no idea to check the floor. I wish there was some kind of way that hidden walls could have some sort of subtle clue hinting that you could go through them or something, but maybe that would take away from the experience for some people who like the challenge. The best moment I had with the level design was with this amazing secret. I took a leap off a cliff and landed in an underwater labyrinth. Deep inside the water caves, I carefully looked at each wall for monsters and items, and noticed just barely that one of the walls looked almost like a face. I moved closer and found that it was indeed some kind of bas-relief of a person on the wall. I hit the search button and... That was a brilliant moment that rewarded players for paying attention and combing every single bit of the map. There's more than a few moments that reward patient, methodical searching. Like if you leap off one of these minecarts at one section, you're in a new area with a hidden spell in it. If you normally find that kind of exploration too slow, you're really missing out on the feeling of triumph you get when you gain access to a new item or area that suddenly appears in front of you. Combat in Kingsfield 4 is far and above the greatest difference it has with the comparatively lightning-paced Souls games, and it's likely to be the greatest stumbling block you have when playing. First and foremost, we have to talk about the movement speed. It's slow. And when I say slow, it's slow. It's glacial. The previous 3 games in the Kingsfield series also had very slow movement, but for some inexplicable reason, the ancient city made it even slower. The way you move, it's like your hero is trapped in molasses, or shifting about with the odd, slowed-down pace of a dream. More importantly than your walking speed, your turning speed is absurdly slow. Almost comically, ridiculously slower than any human would ever move under any circumstance. It can be just awful in the middle of a difficult battle. You've been deliberately depowered and can die just because your character can't turn faster than an arthritic turtle. You really have to plan ahead before you make any move. You can run in the game, if by run you mean move at about the same speed as octogenarian mall walkers. And running also eats up your stamina, which means that if you suddenly run across a monster, you're going to have to wait for the stamina to recharge. It also makes your magic stamina go down. So it's very, very punishing. There's also something else here that you've probably noticed. You need to constantly pause the game in order to use items. And this is a major issue. It just really kills the momentum of whatever it is you're doing. It feels a heck of a lot like Dragon's Dogma, more than the Souls series. And it's an unfortunate part of the game's combat that you just have to keep bringing up the menu over and over again if you ever get injured. When you begin, the entire game can kind of feel like this, like it's unresponsive and clunky. I freely admit that there is that jankiness I mentioned back in the intro, and it's all in the movement and combat. But I'm urging anyone thinking of giving this game a chance not to be turned off by the movement. It takes a while, but you will get into the slow-motion groove of Kingsfield 4. There is an almost tranquilizing, relaxing effect to the game's combat system. Patiently moving into just the right place, then strafing away to avoid a counter. It's more akin to a survival horror game's tank control style than an action game. Not exactly the same, but it seems to be kind of influenced by that. One of the games made for the original PlayStation by From Software is Shadow Tower, a game very similar to the Kingsfield series, but it has its own oppressive, gloomy, much more survival horror-ish atmosphere and playstyle to it. You have no choice but to take things very slowly, searching every single area. It does demand an extraordinary level of patience and planning ahead before each encounter. The combat is admittedly fairly repetitious, but certainly not devoid of strategy. You have to pay close attention to your surroundings lest you get trapped in a corner and torn to pieces, especially because doors automatically close behind you, leaving you trapped in a room with a monster. You also can't easily extract yourself from a dangerous attack or spell, so every mistake is punished brutally. Almost every enemy should be carefully approached, preferably from behind, so they can't retaliate before you can escape. And it may be that here is the germ we found for the backstab mechanics in the Souls games. Magic can be learned from hidden magic crystals scattered around the world. Taking time to discover all of the secret areas and chests to have a large arsenal of spells is key to victory. Some of the spells are utility-based, like the all-important healing and poison cure spells, but most of them are combat-focused. Unfortunately, I didn't really find any need for such an immense variety of spells. I just stuck to one, an ice spell, and used it over and over. Maybe if they shortened the list of spells and made each one vital to a specific area, or drastically different in damage, range, or how many enemies you hit in one spell, it would have made it a bit more exciting. There are dozens of different weapons in the game that vary in their utility depending on your playstyle. Rapiers are swift thrusting weapons, polearms are slow but very strong, maces are good against skeletal enemies, and so forth. Each weapon has one of several damage types, so it's best to switch one out for another, depending on the opponent. The crucial difference of all weapons is how long it takes you to restore your stamina after you attack. And another very key similarity between this and the Souls series, you'll have to withdraw after you swing your sword, whether you hit or not, in order to regain your stamina. Like in the Secret of Mana series, you can't just flail your sword around willy-nilly. If your stamina bar is not at full strength, you can still attack, but it will be woefully underpowered. There are giant heavy two-handed swords in the game that I really wanted to like, but I found them to be far too slow on the recharge to even use. You can find new weapons at merchants, but for the most part it's not really cost-effective to bother buying them, because you can find so many weapons in the game. Like for instance this one, you shouldn't really even bother buying this one, the bugger sword. I wonder what you do with the bugger sword. There is a weapon upgrade system that is surprisingly almost totally pointless. You can comfortably ignore leveling up your weapon. New and better weapons are found continually right up to the end of the game to replace your old, outdated items. Upgrading is even further pushed into uselessness because you must first unlock the blacksmith, well, unfreeze him from ice, technically, which only happens around the halfway point of the game, and then collect the upgrade stones you need, and after that wait up to 10 minutes for him to completely upgrade your weapon, just like you had to wait for repairs in Daggerfall. It all feels like it was never really developed properly and left in the game, after further design decisions made it useless. Your weapons and armor can degrade over time and break, but again, you collect so many weapons so often, it's very rare for one to break, ever. Although repair is useful if you find a broken katana blade deep in the water caves level. If you repair it, you can become a full-fledged katana-swinging samurai. Armor is much more likely to break over time, and sometimes when you find armor in the game, it's not at full strength anyway, so you need to get it repaired, and the defensive value of the armor decreases as the durability goes down, so it does have some use there, but it's really just more of a nuisance than anything else. The game claims that there are over 100 different enemy types to be found in the Land of Disaster. The starter enemies are the standard giant Venus flytraps, found I think in all of the Kingsfield games, some giant beetles, and skeletons. Most of the monsters in the early game move with the same clumsy slowness that you do. The undead creatures especially have the appearance of barely functional automatons, brought back by necromantic magic. It seems to flow so well with your own graceless movement, I expected every enemy in the game to be like that. Imagine my surprise several hours later when living monsters are encountered and they move with brutal swiftness. Well, for a Kingsfield game at least. Later on you'll be fighting serpent men, long before Sen's Fortress was a thing, a hideous demon enemy that the game claims is an elemental, but looks so much like the dog xenomorphs from Alien 3, I just call it a demon. There are even Hydralisk-like enemies in the snake tunnels later on. Eventually drow archers show up, I think they're drow anyway, I mean look at them. There's this weird giant that spits poison into his hand and then throws it at you, sort of like a toxic wet willy. There are boss fights here and there in the game, but there is mercifully little fanfare about them. I genuinely just stop playing a Soulsborne game sometimes out of sheer exhaustion, because the game was brought to a grinding halt by the requirement to fight a brutally difficult boss encounter to progress. Kingsfield 4 is about exploration, not dramatic boss encounters with soaring orchestral music that forces you to memorize an elaborate button combination and perform it with perfect accuracy for 10 minutes straight. That's not to say that the boss encounters in Kingsfield 4 are not memorable. My favorite is this giant Balrog demon in the lava caves. Love the sadistic smile on his face, getting some vibes of a fire version of Papa Nurgle from Warhammer. There's also these gigantic snakes, and predictably in the snake area, the Emporus, I think that's supposed to say Empress, who is a gigantic Medusa-like snake woman. The final boss encounter is especially epic. You go to the very heart of evil, or maybe the brain of evil. The entire area has a biological feel, a bit like Abydos, the deadly inner war. Heinous dragons and purplish blobby conjunctions of molecules spawn from the pits of murky fluid like white blood cells forming up to terminate an invader. Ancient graphics or no, Kingsfield 4 has great monsters with a bizarre, creepy look. The combat in the Kingsfield games doesn't really get the love it deserves because of the severe jankiness involved. But the grinding slowness of movement and simplicity in the combat is something any player can quickly attune themselves to. I actually enjoy playing a game with combat like that because it lets me focus more on discovery rather than battle. In Dark Souls, I'm a bit too focused on just staying alive than observing the environment. It gets the blood pumping, but dulls the senses to the pure joy of unearthing new worlds.
Guys, it's amazing, but the batteries on our lights will run out, so I suggest we keep moving.
We gained so much with the advanced combat systems of the Souls games, but we no longer have the patience it took to just lose yourself in an adventure and feel like you're really tunneling under the earth to discover an ancient civilization. It's also quite possible that we got the kind of combat in the Souls series because of the Kingsfield legacy. Instead of some sort of dreadful hack-and-slash nonsense like Castlevania Lords of Shadow, or a dozen other brainless action games, we got the intense, stamina-based, stripped-down battles we've all come to know and love. Love it or hate it, the Kingsfield games are important legacies for later Souls combat. And they're also good just on their own. You don't have to just endure the combat, you can actually enjoy it. It's actually an important part of experiencing this world. When compared to the other 3 games in the Kingsfield series, the Ancient City is likely the best looking since it was made on the newest hardware, though that really isn't saying very much by modern standards. 20 years on, Kingsfield 4 has the same blocky, low-res look as the PlayStation trilogy. If we discount the tech snobbery about polygon count and graphical capability though, Kingsfield 4 is still an artistically beautiful game. With the limited power of the PS2, they created an atmospheric world with amazing vistas to explore and grotesque monsters to battle. Moving past the aesthetics though, it's hard to say if the Ancient City is the best game in the tetralogy overall. Not because of anything wrong with 4, but because Kingsfield 3, known as Kingsfield 2 in North America, is just so darn good. Not only does 3 play better, and by better I mean faster, it's also got much more overall content and a more challenging path to the good ending. You need to go through some hurdles and do some intriguing things in order to get it in Kingsfield 3. Kingsfield 3 is an excellent game and probably deserves equal status along with the Ancient City. That isn't criticizing, again, the Ancient City, it's just because both of these games are so good, they're probably deserving of equal status in the series. 4 was the final game in the series, but the PS2 had 2 more From Software games with a very similar look and feel. Maybe we can call them Kingsfield adjacent games. Shadow Tower Abyss, expanding on the PlayStation game, takes the survival horror potential of Kingsfield and just turns it into a straight horror game instead of purely an RPG. Before Kingsfield 4 was released, we got Eternal Ring, a less grimdark, more fantasy adventure fun style of Kingsfield. Both games, especially Shadow Tower Abyss, are excellent in their own right, but miss out, I think, on the totality of mystery and gloomy wonder you get from the Ancient City. As for subsequent From Software RPG games, we can instantly notice a considerable amount of Dark Souls DNA in Kingsfield 4. Not just in the Moonlight Sword or Crestfallen Warrior either. The main hub area, along with the half-submerged pyramid in the water caves, has an eerie similarity to the watery underground city of Shulva in Dark Souls 2. There's also an icy area that you must warm up to interact with the frozen people and objects within, again like another DLC from Dark Souls 2, the Crown of the Ivory King. There's also a map which slowly lights up as you progress in the game, just like a mansion in the hub world of DS2. The Souls series did not just spring fully formed out of the ether. The generally grimdark tone, slower pace of combat, brutal difficulty, incremental progression by unlocking shortcuts, ambiguous or dark endings, hidden walls galore, it was all the jumping off point for the Souls series. The Ancient City is probably the best conclusion to a series that was already showing its age even in the PS2 era. But I'll reiterate what I said earlier. Kingsfield 4, The Ancient City, is worth playing on its own right. It has its own unique, slow-motion charm to it, a kind of relaxing exploration adventure that the later Souls series kind of lacked. I always thought the Souls series were a bit relaxing in a way, even though you were fighting for your life half the time, because all of these games, Kingsfield and Souls alike, have this incredible power to transport you into a truly empty place. Ruins, castles, villages, an entire kingdom that seems bizarrely empty of life, where nature has returned to prominence and the only thinking creatures that are left are barely alive, zombified remains of a former culture. They all do that great. Like one of those bizarre Twilight Zone episodes where everyone has suddenly disappeared and a lonely man has to stalk through an eerie world that's faintly menacing because of its sheer silence and lack of activity. So even if you can't say it, of course, has the best combat, and you can't say that it looks the best compared to the later games, I would say that that's one thing that Kingsfield 4 does the best, wondering what happened here, and why the zombified remains are still stalking the land after all this time. That's something that Kingsfield 4 is a masterpiece at. The PlayStation 2 has such a huge library of amazing games, it's easy for some to slip through the cracks. Especially because there are so many excellent JRPGs like the Persona or the Final Fantasy games. Amidst a library of more anime-influenced games with glorious upbeat soundtracks and much more cheerful game worlds, it's easy to forget about masterpieces of darkness like Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne or Kingsfield 4: The Ancient City. Tragically, the game is very expensive nowadays, and purchasing a physical copy is going to set you back quite a bit. If there is ever a PlayStation 2 mini console, Kingsfield 4 would be a perfect addition because of its rarity and excellence. But if you have a way to play this game, I would urge you to do so. Ironically, Kingsfield 4, a game about exploring a lost civilization, has itself become a kind of ancient ruin in the video game world, barely remembered and even then only as a distant ancestor of the Souls series. It's time to rescue this game from obscurity and make it more than a simple curiosity. The Ancient City is the very definition of a hidden gem, a lost masterpiece of action role-playing that stands the test of time by giving you a mysterious, rich world to explore, with a dark story to uncover. Jankiness at all, it is one of the best games that you could play in the role-playing genre on the PlayStation 2. And it's a crime that it's so little known nowadays. Well, that's all for me today. My name is Mike, and if you have played this game, what did you think of it, and what do you think is the best game in the Kingsfield series? You may also want to check out some of my other videos about role-playing games, and yeah, that's it. Good night. Umbasa.
Though eternity lies before thee, thy work in the land of the living is not done. Return, brave ones.
And watch more videos.